My name is Amber Matthews. I'm 29 years old, and last month I inherited something far more than money. I inherited a war I never asked to fight. My grandfather, Harold Matthews, left me everything when he passed. His estate, worth over $2 million, came with his stores, his real estate, and something more sacred, his trust. The day after his funeral, my mother Patricia demanded I sign it all over to her. I refused, and that's when it began. A storm I hadn't seen coming, but one I would learn to walk through with quiet, focused strength. My mother wasn't always like this. At least that's what I used to tell myself. But the older I got, the more I noticed her hunger for wealth and her resentment toward those who earned it. My grandfather built his business from nothing. One store, one hammer, one client at a time. He taught me what he believed the world had forgotten, that character matters more than charm, and discipline matters more than desire. I spent weekends in his store learning inventory before I ever touched a college textbook. Patricia, on the other hand, spent her youth buying cars with borrowed money and pretending that money existed to be worshipped, not managed. She married my stepfather, Craig, a man who matched her recklessness but lacked even her charm. They remortgaged the house more times than I could count. When Grandpa paid for my braces, she sold the ring he gave her to cover her spa debt. When he saved money for my tuition, she took it for Rachel's emergency procedures, which turned out to be elective surgery and a beach trip. I worked through college, I paid off my loans, and while Grandpa slipped into heart failure, I sat by his bed, notebook in hand, as he made me promise one thing: when it's your turn, don't back down. You'll be standing alone, but you'll be standing right. I didn't know what he meant until the day we read his will. I'll never forget that silence, that thick, shocked, judgmental silence in the law office. The air turned cold as Mr. Paterson read my name and listed every single thing Grandpa left me. There was no confusion. He was precise. Patricia didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice cut like a knife. "This is a mistake. Read it again." I didn't flinch. Mr. Peterson confirmed, "There is no mistake. That was the day I lost my mother, and somehow it was the day I began to truly find myself." Outside the office, she cornered me and said, "Transfer everything to me. Do the right thing." And I said the quietest, strongest word I've ever spoken in my life: no. The next morning, I got a text from her. "Family meeting, 3 p.m. at the house. Be there." I didn't reply. I didn't panic. I just stared at the screen, knowing this wasn't just a meeting, it was a trap. But if they were setting a trap, they were going to find out the hard way. I wasn't the one who was going to be caught. I didn't sleep the night before the meeting. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't stop cataloging every moment that led us here, every manipulated memory, every time my mother smiled like a queen and expected me to kneel. Growing up, she called me the quiet one. Not because I lacked a voice, but because I never screamed for attention like Rachel did. I watched, I listened, I remembered, and now every unspoken truth was rising like a tide she could no longer control. There's something surreal about realizing your family doesn't love you. They love what they can take from you. I'd always hoped my silence was a kind of loyalty, that my mother's cruelty was a misunderstanding, that Rachel's jealousy would fade with time. But standing in front of my bathroom mirror the morning of the meeting, I finally said it out loud. They don't see me as family, they see me as a resource, a vault they thought they had the code to. Ethan, my boyfriend, begged me not to go alone. "They're going to try to break you," he said, "and you're still grieving." But I told him something I hadn't even told myself before. "I need to face them, Ethan. If I run from this, I'll spend my life running from every bully who thinks love is something they can buy or bend." He didn't argue. He just held my hand and said, "Then don't let them forget who they're dealing with." The house looked the same as it always had. Too clean, too perfect, too hollow. I'd memorized that front door. It had slammed behind me so many times during childhood arguments that it was practically a punctuation mark. I walked in without knocking. My mother, stepfather, and siblings were already seated, but it was the two men in suits beside them that made me stop cold. They weren't just family friends, they were lawyers. "Amber," my mother purred, "meet our legal advisors." I didn't sit, not right away. I looked each one of them in the eye, and I let the silence do what it always does best, reveal everyone's discomfort. Patricia gestured toward the only chair facing the group like a spotlight. I took it. The man with the briefcase started speaking about burdens of wealth and family unity. They didn't even try to pretend. They wanted everything, every dollar, every deed, every asset, and they were prepared to twist my grandfather's memory to get it. But the more they spoke, the calmer I became, because in that moment I realized something powerful. They had nothing I needed, but I had everything they wanted, and I wasn't going to give it to them. I listened to their pitch with the calm of a woman who already knew the outcome. My mother was all fake sympathy and sharp smiles, selling the idea that this was what Grandpa would have really wanted. Craig hovered nearby, arms crossed like some bouncer at a bar I never wanted to enter. Rachel wouldn't meet my eyes, and Jason, sweet silent Jason, just sat there, trapped somewhere between loyalty and fear. When the lawyer handed me the papers, my hands didn't shake. That alone unsettled them. It was all laid out. I was to sign over control of the business, transfer the investment accounts, and relinquish rights to all properties in exchange for a vague family-managed disbursement plan. They called it fairness. I called it theft in a silk tie. I didn't argue. I just turned the pages slowly, letting them watch me read every line, like I was preparing their eulogy. When I got to the end, I looked up and asked, "Is this your final offer?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Don't be dramatic, Amber. This isn't a negotiation. This is you doing the right thing." Her voice had the polished venom of someone who had rehearsed her role. But I had something she didn't know about. Proof. The kind of proof that cuts clean through polite lies and bloodlines. I reached into my leather portfolio and placed a folded letter on the table. The handwriting was unmistakable. My grandfather's. "Before I make any decisions," I said, "I want to read this aloud." The room tensed like a coiled spring. I opened the letter and began to read. It was dated 3 months before Grandpa's passing. In it he wrote, "Amber, if you're reading this, it means your mother is doing exactly what I feared. She doesn't understand stewardship. She understands control. This estate is my legacy. I didn't build it so it could be drained by recklessness. I built it for someone who understands sacrifice. That's you." The silence was thick. I let it linger, then placed the letter beside the contract they had handed me. "You want me to sign something today?" I said quietly. "Here's what I've signed instead. A life of discipline, a promise to honor a man who trusted me when no one else did." Patricia's smile evaporated. Craig looked at the lawyers like they'd miscalculated. Rachel started crying. And Jason looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I leaned back in my chair and said what they had all feared from the beginning. "You don't get to rewrite his legacy just because you regret not earning it." Then I stood, gathering my portfolio slowly. "This meeting is over. Next time, bring an actual case, not just desperation dressed in designer clothes." The moment I walked out of that house, the air felt different, lighter, somehow like the truth had finally started to do its quiet work. But I knew the silence wouldn't last. Patricia wasn't the type to retreat just because her plan failed. She was the kind of woman who saw resistance as disrespect. And now that I had refused to play her game, she'd rewrite the rules just to trap me in another one. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from a law office I'd never heard of. Inside was a formal intent to contest the will notice. The grounds: undue influence by the primary beneficiary due to proximity and deteriorating health of the deceased. I read it 3 times, then slid it across the table to Samantha, the lawyer Ethan had introduced me to. She raised an eyebrow, then chuckled softly. "This isn't a case," she said. "It's a tantrum in legal form." But tantrums can still leave bruises, and Patricia knew that. While Samantha drafted our response, my mother went to work in her usual way by poisoning the well. She called my old college professor, claiming I'd manipulated my way through school. She sent emails to Ethan's parents, full of vague accusations and veiled warnings. She even called a former boss of mine, asking if they'd noticed any signs of instability, all of it designed to make me question myself. But it didn't work, because I had something stronger than fear. I had facts. I had Grandpa's journal, his own detailed log of every dollar given to Patricia and Craig, every broken promise, every manipulated request. I had screenshots of texts, timestamps from Instagram posts proving medical emergencies were really vacations, and I had recordings, clear time-stamped calls where Craig drunkenly admitted their plan to take control before Grandpa died. Samantha built the case quietly but thoroughly. "We're not just defending the will," she told me. "We're proving a pattern: financial abuse, coercion, and now attempted legal intimidation." Meanwhile, I did what Patricia never expected. I stayed calm. I didn't react publicly. I didn't post online. I didn't even tell Rachel or Jason about the legal battle at first. I just kept living, quietly, steadily, as if their chaos no longer had permission to follow me home. Then, something happened that shifted everything. Jason showed up at my door late one night, backpack slung over his shoulder. "I can't stay there anymore," he said. "She's spiraling, drinking, screaming, calling you names that don't even make sense." He looked at me with guilt clouding his eyes. "I didn't believe you at first, but now I see it." I stepped aside and let him in. "You don't have to explain," I told him gently. "You're home now." Jason moved into my apartment, the way a person walks into shelter after a long storm, unsure if he's welcome, still bracing for the next strike. I gave him my spare key, a clean blanket, and something our family rarely offered freely: peace. For the first few nights he barely spoke, but when he did, it came in fragments, stories I hadn't heard, patterns I hadn't seen, glimpses of just how deep Patricia's manipulation ran. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, and Jason had finally stepped out of it. Meanwhile, Rachel had gone quiet. No late-night texts, no vague social media jabs, just silence. That's when I knew something was shifting behind the scenes. Patricia was losing her grip, and in her desperation, she was likely turning inward, pointing blame at the only people still within reach. Craig had reportedly moved out for business reasons, but Jason told me the truth. He'd finally said something Patricia didn't like, and she'd turned her fury on him too. "It's like a fire looking for something to burn," he said one night. "You escaped. Now she's torching what's left." Samantha finalized our response to the challenge of the will, attaching Grandpa's journal excerpts and George's letter of testimony. "This is more than enough to shut it down," she assured me. "But we're going to do more than shut it down. We're going to close the door behind it for good." We filed a motion for dismissal and submitted our own petition to secure control of the estate permanently, requesting that Patricia and her legal team be barred from future contestation based on harassment and fraud. Then came the hearing. Not a trial, just a procedural review in front of a probate judge. Patricia didn't even show. Her lawyers appeared alone, visibly rattled, holding nothing but a weak argument about emotional closeness and influence through grief. Samantha countered with surgical precision, laying out the paper trail like a forensic path through financial deceit. When she read out loud the section of Grandpa's letter that said Amber is the only one who understands the value of what I built, one of the lawyers actually winced. The judge didn't deliberate long. In 15 minutes the petition was dismissed. The will stood, and I was granted full legal control of the estate. "This wasn't a victory," I told Samantha quietly afterward. "It was a funeral for their illusion of entitlement." She nodded. "And now that it's buried, you can finally build." I left the courthouse lighter than I had been in weeks. But the true weight hadn't lifted until I got home and found Jason in the kitchen, cooking dinner with quiet concentration. "So," he said, "what now?" I didn't even hesitate. "Now we build something Grandpa would be proud of, and we start by deciding who we're going to be without them." The office still smelled like Grandpa's cologne, cedarwood, and old paper. I hadn't touched his desk since the funeral. Now, with the court ruling finalized, I sat in his chair for the first time, fingers tracing the worn grooves in the wood, like I was reaching across time. On the wall behind me hung a faded photo of his first store, the one he opened with a second-hand cash register and a handwritten sign, Matthews Hardware. No frills, no gimmicks, just honest work. That was the legacy I'd inherited, and the weight of it pressed down on me. The first week back in the business was brutal. Some of the store managers weren't thrilled about the girl from college running things. They remembered me as the kid who helped organize paint swatches and stock shelves, not the woman reviewing their quarterly numbers and flagging inefficiencies. But I didn't try to prove myself with speeches or demands. I showed up early, asked questions, walked the aisles and took notes. I knew Grandpa's philosophy by heart. You don't lead with noise, you lead by noticing what others miss. Jason came with me whenever his class schedule allowed. Watching him interact with employees, I saw a side of him that had never been given space to grow. He remembered details from Grandpa's old stories, and more importantly, he paid attention the way Grandpa had taught me to. One afternoon, after a long strategy meeting, he looked at me and said, "I don't want to just help, I want in, long term." I nodded slowly, the thought already forming. This could be ours together. We started discussing expansion, diversification, ideas Grandpa had shelved when his health declined. Eco-friendly materials, local supplier partnerships, digitized inventory systems. The future of Matthews Hardware wasn't just about surviving the giants like Home Depot. It was about offering something they couldn't: real human connection, generational wisdom, and community investment. For the first time since all this began, I wasn't just protecting Grandpa's legacy, I was shaping my own. Of course, Patricia tried to claw back control in her usual way, not through courts but through whispers. She sent messages to local business owners claiming I was selling off Harold's soul by modernizing the stores. But those rumors died quickly, drowned out by our work. Revenue rose, morale improved, and customers noticed. One woman stopped me at our flagship location and said, "You know, your grandpa used to fix things before you even asked. You have his eyes." I smiled and replied, "And now, his keys." Ethan watched it all unfold with quiet pride. One night, as we closed the books after another successful week, he poured 2 glasses of wine and said, "I always knew you had this in you." I raised an eyebrow. Even when I doubted myself, he leaned forward. Especially then, we toasted, not to revenge, not to survival, but to purpose. I was no longer the quiet girl in the corner of the will reading. I was the woman rebuilding a name that deserved to last. Rachel reached out in the most unexpected way. A handwritten letter. Not a text, not a DM, not a cryptic social media post. Just a plain white envelope slid under my apartment door with her careful script on the front. Amber. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, half expecting another passive-aggressive guilt trip. But inside was a note that began, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." And with that first line, everything shifted. She wrote about the pressure of being the golden child, the performance of being perfect while knowing our mother's love was conditional, how she clung to Patricia's approval like oxygen, even when it meant resenting me, because I represented something she could never quite earn. She admitted to knowing about the money Grandpa gave for my college, the trips they took with his medical fund, and even overhearing plans to challenge the will. "I kept quiet because I didn't want to be left out," she wrote, "but now I see I was already left behind." It would have been easy to tear that letter in half, to say it was too little, too late. But part of me, the part that remembered braiding her hair before school and sneaking her cookies when she cried after Mum yelled, wanted to believe she meant it. So I wrote back. Just 2 words. "Let's talk." We met at a neutral cafe near campus. She looked older than I remembered, like regret had aged her more than time. "I thought you hated me," she said, not even waiting for our drinks. I shook my head slowly. "No, I hated who you became to survive her." What followed was a conversation full of starts and stops, truth and tension. She told me about how Patricia had turned on her once the legal battle ended, accusing her of being weak, disloyal, even jealous of me. "It's like living with a woman who's always waiting for someone to disappoint her," Rachel whispered, "and now I finally did." I asked if she was still living at home. She shook her head. "I left last week. I'm crashing with a friend. I don't know what's next." I reached for her hand. "Then maybe it's time we figure that out together." When I told Jason about the meeting, he was quiet. "Do you trust her?" he asked. "I trust that she's hurting," I replied, "and I trust that healing has to start somewhere." He nodded slowly. "If she's serious, maybe we give her a role in the foundation. Start small, something structured with oversight." It was his idea, not mine. That's how I knew we were healing too, not just as individuals but as siblings, as the generation trying to rebuild something that had been broken long before we were born. Later that night, Rachel sent a voice message, shaky, tearful but sincere. "Thank you for meeting me. Thank you for not slamming the door. I know I have a lot to make up for. I don't expect it to be easy. I just want to try." I didn't reply right away. I let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as space. Because real forgiveness doesn't rush. It roots, it rebuilds, and maybe, just maybe, we were finally ready for that. My mother didn't know it yet, but the game was over. Not because she lost the estate, or the legal battle, or her carefully curated image. Those were just symptoms. What she truly lost, the thing that undid her, was control. The moment I stopped reacting, she stopped mattering. The moment Jason moved in with me, she lost her leverage. And the moment Rachel stopped believing her stories, she lost her audience. But still, I wrote her one final letter, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. I didn't waste words trying to heal what she refused to see. I didn't write to convince her or correct her. I wrote to release her. "Mom," it began, "this is not a letter to mend our relationship. It's a letter to set boundaries. You chose your battles, you made your threats, and you watched as your children walked away, one by one. I am no longer carrying your disappointment or your debt. You're free to feel whatever you want, but you're not free to weaponize it anymore." I included the terms of the trust Samantha and I had created, a modest monthly stipend, contingent on zero further contact or harassment, structured like a contract, not a lifeline. It wasn't a gift, it was a firewall. I didn't offer her forgiveness. That would have required accountability. But I offered something else, distance with dignity. She could rebuild if she wanted, but she would have to do it without me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking her permission to walk away. Samantha mailed it by certified courier, with proof of receipt. 3 days later, I received a short typed reply. "I accept the terms. Do not contact me again." No apology, no emotion, just cold acknowledgement. Ethan read it and exhaled. "So that's it." I folded the letter slowly. "That's it." But even as I said it, I felt the quiet grief creep in. Not for the woman she was, but for the mother I once imagined she could become. Some losses don't scream, they just ache. Jason took it harder than I expected. "She really cut us off," he said one night, pacing the hallway, "like we never existed." I watched him carefully, letting him feel it instead of fixing it. "She's still your mum," I said softly, "but now she's just someone we used to survive." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "I don't hate her, you know." I smiled gently. "That's how you know you're healing." That weekend, I lit a candle in Grandpa's study. A quiet ritual. No prayer, just presence. I sat in his old chair and whispered, "She signed it, Grandpa." She walked away. And for the first time since his death, I didn't cry. Because this time, it didn't feel like I was losing someone. It felt like I was gaining myself. We didn't celebrate with champagne or speeches. We celebrated with sweat, spreadsheets, and a vision. The will had survived. The trust was protected. My mother was silent. And now the question was no longer how do I defend this? It was what will I build? Matthew's Hardware wasn't just a business anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of legacy, of what happens when someone is trusted to lead. and refuses to misuse that trust. Jason flourished. He started part-time in logistics, shadowing managers, learning the structure from the inside. Every night, he'd come home with ideas, ways to reduce waste, optimize delivery routes, create internship programs for local youth. He was everything our mother said he wouldn't be without her. Focused, grounded, full of purpose. One night, he asked if we could add Grandpa's quote to the storefront: "Character first, profit second, always." I said yes without hesitation. Rachel surprisingly held true to her word. She took a part-time admin role at the Matthews Foundation, our non-profit arm supporting young entrepreneurs. She was quiet, steady, different. We didn't talk about the past much, but one day, as we loaded grant applications into a filing cabinet, she whispered, "I'm not ready to face Mom, but I'm not afraid of her anymore either." I looked at her and saw not the sister who betrayed me, but the woman who chose to return. Ethan proposed at the top of my grandfather's first store, the old rooftop he used to climb for silence and sky. There was no audience, no photographers, just us and the wind. "You took everything they tried to weaponize against you," he said, slipping the ring on my finger, "and you made it holy." I cried, not because I was surprised, but because I finally felt safe, not in someone else's love, but in my own ability to choose wisely. Samantha helped us restructure the company, not just legally, but philosophically. We added a mentoring branch, offering shadow programs to local teens. We launched eco-initiatives, started selling local products, partnered with female-led manufacturers. Grandpa's business, once a brick-and-mortar fortress, had become a breathing, evolving force. It was no longer about preserving his legacy, it was about honoring it by transforming it. And through it all, my grandfather's presence never left. In every decision made with integrity, in every young employee we promoted based on character, not charm, in every customer who said, "You run it like your grandfather did, but better." That's when I realized something sacred. His real legacy wasn't the business or the money, it was the values he planted, and the fact that they found soil in me. A year passed, quietly, beautifully. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, it just settles in your bones like it was always meant to live there. The lawsuits faded into memory. My mother stayed silent, true to her final words. Jason made the dean's list and asked to take over one of the smaller store branches. Rachel began therapy. Ethan and I began planning our wedding in the backyard of the house that once held war, but now overflowed with restoration. The house felt different now, lighter. The walls no longer echoed with past manipulation or hushed resentments. Instead, they carried the laughter of late-night brainstorming sessions with Jason, the hum of jazz as Rachel filed documents in the foundation office, and the quiet companionship of Ethan reading next to me on the couch. We didn't avoid the past, we just stopped letting it lead, and somehow that became our greatest act of defiance. One afternoon, while organizing Grandpa's study, I found a note tucked into the back of an old ledger. It was addressed to no one, likely never meant to be seen. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "I don't know how they'll remember me, but I hope at least one of them learns that strength doesn't come from taking, it comes from protecting." I held the paper against my chest and whispered, "I learned, I really did." I never saw Patricia again, but sometimes in the quiet moments, I still think of her, not out of anger, not even sadness, just a distant kind of empathy for the woman who was handed so much and spent her whole life clawing for more, never realizing she already had what mattered. I can't rewrite her story, but I can be the woman she never chose to become, stable, secure, and at peace with enough. On the anniversary of Grandpa's passing, we hosted a community event at the flagship store. Food trucks, live music, free workshops, a celebration not of death but of legacy. People from all over came, old customers, new faces, neighbors who remembered the man who once fixed their fences for free. As the sun set and fairy lights blinked on across the lot, I stood on a small stage and looked out at the crowd, and I saw it, the living proof of what love with discipline can build. I didn't inherit my grandfather's fortune. I inherited his fight, his values, his blueprint for something unshakable. And in honoring that, I found myself, not the girl who used to tiptoe around family dysfunction, not the woman they underestimated, but the builder, the protector, the one who turned silence into strategy, betrayal into legacy, and broken bloodlines into boundaries. Thank you for hearing my story. If you're in the middle of something like this, a family battle, a quiet betrayal, a storm you didn't create, know this: you don't have to fight with rage, you just have to stay rooted in who you are. Let them unravel, you stay steady. That's the victory they'll never understand, and the peace they'll never be able to take from you.